Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So, if you follow my channel, you probably know about my obsession with heroes, and that's probably in part why you're here. And I'm sure most of you have asked yourselves the question, when are we ever going to get back to a time when true heroism actually can be shown both in our entertainment, on the page, on the screen, and in our lives itself? And that's the question I'm going to tackle today. When is that time going to come around again? Because I actually think it's coming around much sooner than I anticipated. Things are changing at a significantly rapid pace right now. But before we get into that, just to remind you, there are 2 links in the description and the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels that center around a true traditional hero. There are 2 superhero graphic novels and 1 low fantasy, all with spectacular art, some of which you're looking at in the background. So if any of that sounds or looks appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description or the pinned comment and go on over and see if one of my graphic novels is for you. But back to our topic. So what is this rapid change that I'm speaking of? Well, let's tackle something very immediate at first, and then I'll go into the roots of what I'm talking about. What is happening over the last 2 weeks, I think, is that the Vice President of the United States is actually having to school people, leaders, not just political leaders, but also religious leaders, on the idea of the Order Amores, the order of love. And the thing is that the Order Amores, the order of love, is one of the essential parts for the growth of true heroism. Now, what am I talking about? Well, the vice president went on an interview and said, there is an order amores. There is an order of love. There is an order of charity and love for yourself and those around you. It goes out like concentric circles. You start by having love for yourself, then love for your family, then love for your friends, then love for your community, then love for your country. And this is the way that love is supposed to be ordered. It is like dropping a drop of water into a still pond. Concentric circles going outward. You can't just skip to the 4th or 5th circle outward. The way that reality works is that those concentric circles must go in a very specific order. And this is the order of love which he is discussing within the interview. And he got some pushback, especially from people who claim to be church leaders. And they were saying, this is an idea. It's an ancient idea, by the way. They were tracing it back to Thomas Aquinas, but it's much older than that. And they were saying, this isn't actually true. And again, he had to, on social media, school these people saying, no, the order of love is the way that reality works. If you don't think this, then tackle the entire canon of not only philosophy, but also moral theology for Western civilization. It is part and parcel of what Western civilization is. And he had to take them to school. Now, I'm going to step back from that for a few minutes, to say the least, and give you my own personal experience with this Order Amores. And I typically don't like to talk a lot about myself, but you guys tend to enjoy when I do this, so I'll give you the entire backstory because it is very significantly connected to what I'm very passionate about and what I'm talking about today, and the Order Amores. And of course, how that is connected to the rebirth of true heroism. Now, for myself growing up, what I spent the majority of my money on was comic books. But secondary to that was video games. And the thing was that we used to have a ColecoVision back when everybody else had an Atari. And then we bought a Commodore 128. And the game that I loved so much on the ColecoVision was Venture. It was basically the most basic dungeon crawl you could ever think of. And this led into the kinds of games that we bought for our Commodore 128. They were typically RPGs. We started off with Dungeons and Dragons games and moved into other kinds of games that were similar to that. We played Shard of Spring, Curse of the Azerabons, Warriors of Krynn, I think that's how you pronounce that, and a whole host that I'm sure I'm forgetting about, until probably the last games I played of this kind were Baldur's Gate 2, Icewind Dale. But in the middle of all of this, the most influential game, I think, of them all for me was the Ultima series. Now, if you don't know, the Ultima series was basically a D&D knockoff for the first 3 games that it had. But in Edition 4, it became something significantly different. Why? Because you had to live according to virtue. The game was called Quest of the Avatar, back in a time when people didn't know what an avatar was. You had to become an avatar of virtue. Now, these virtues were not the virtues that I usually talk about. They were very specific to the game. But that's how the storyline progressed through all 9 titles. The most influential for me, honestly, would be Quest of the Avatar, and then Ultima 7, which is separated into 2 parts. And let me tell you right here, right now, if you play video games, if you watch science fiction and fantasy, if you watch or read anime and manga, you have been influenced in some way, whether you know it or not, by the Ultima game. They were the ones who pioneered the layout that you're used to with hit points and mana. They were the ones who pioneered the top-down view RPG. They were the ones who, as I said, popularized the use of the term avatar. And you know that idea in anime and manga where you have this little bouncing slime? You know where that came from? That came from a very odd Japanese version of the game. So the cultural significance of this game, especially for sci-fi and fantasy around the world, is massive. For me personally, it was having to spend hundreds of hours trying to seek out virtue in these games in order to complete the games, because you could not complete the games unless you were virtuous. Now, this degraded severely over the years as their games came out, and they kept on pumping out things which were Ultima really only in name, but anyways. And quite honestly, this impacted my life so much. It determined who my best friend was in high school and where I went to my first years of university, quite honestly, because I met this guy in high school. He had Ultima 5. I did not purchase the games. Oh, by the way, purchasing the games actually helped develop my sense of delayed gratification, because there was no way in hell I was going to pay $80, $90 for a game. Doesn't matter how long I would play it. Because why? Because that would be money I couldn't spend on comics. So I would wait, a year and a half until it dropped down to about $20, $30. And then I'd buy it. So when I met this guy in high school and he had Ultima 5 before I would actually buy it, that was huge. And he also introduced me to other games like SimEarth, Red Baron, Wing Commander, Heretic, Doom, Wolfenstein, the very first World of Warcraft. But anyways, so after Ultima 9, Ultima decided to become a MMORPG. One of the first, by the way, which I think is still in operation today over in Japan because they love Ultima. And this actually became a significant turning point in my entire life. Why? Because I had to play this game. I just had to. So what I did was I went to my local library. I downloaded the manual for it because it was all online. And I figured I would do the best parts first. I will get myself engrossed so much in the game so that when it came time to actually figuring out how to pay for it, I would just do it. So what I did was I created my character. This character was a ranger, had some paladin skills, had some thief skills. That's what I always played anyways. It was either a ranger or a paladin, and really the avatar from the Ultima games, which is what you played as, was always a paladin. But anyways, created this character, knew exactly what I was going to do with this character. Then I got down to the nitty-gritty of figuring out how I had to upgrade my system and pay for this entire thing. The first thing was to get an internet connection, which we didn't have back then. I said, okay, can do. It's going to be hard, but I can do that. Second thing was that I needed a credit card in order to actually pay for the game. I said, okay, I am kind of young. I don't know if they'll even grant me a credit card, but I'll see what I can do because there's no way. Again, my parents were going to pay for this on their credit cards. And then I looked at how much the game cost, and it was a lot. Per hour, I think, is how you paid. And I said to myself, okay, I'm already getting into a lot of money here, a lot of money that I really don't have. But I figured to myself, well, what I'll do is I'll work in order to pile up some money, and I'll just play this game like every month, maybe every 2 to 3 months, and just binge it for like 2-3 days. When my money is exhausted, I'll stop playing and then work again and just do that. Because again, I was used to this delayed gratification when it came to video games. I could do that. And then I got down to the nitty gritty. What I thought, if I remember correctly, was the fine print of this entire game. And it made me so angry, I cannot even describe. The fine print of this game was the fact that you would build up skills for your character. You didn't really level up in a traditional way. You'd build up those skills and they would get better and better as you played more and more. But the thing was that these skills would also atrophy, and not atrophy according to game time, but atrophy according to real time. So if I followed my plan that I had, which was to play it, every month, maybe every 3 months, build everything up for my character and just save the character and then continue on the next time I was able to play, that wouldn't work at all. Because if I left the character for a month, the entire skill set that I had built up for the character would have atrophied over the real time of that month, 2 months, 3 months, and I would have to start at zero again. And part of the reason why I was so angry was because here you have this game, which is supposed to be centered around the idea of virtue, and what you're basically doing is saying to the people who are playing this game, the only way that you can make any headway in this game, the only way that this game actually works correctly is if you're addicted to it. And I sat there in my chair and I fumed for really probably only about an hour until I came across a very ridiculous thought in my head. And that ridiculous thought was, if I was going to spend that much time, that much money, that much energy developing skills for this character in this game, which would atrophy according to real time, I could just take all of that and invest it in developing those skills for myself in reality. And then out of that angry thought, I went, wait a minute, that's actually true. I could do that. And since I played a Ranger, Paladin, Thief, which I had set out all of the skills that I wanted to do prior to having this encounter with the ridiculous rules, I knew exactly what to do. And that's what I set out to do. I went to my local library. I took out books on tracking, on hunting, which, I was already experienced a little bit in. Books on campcraft, books on reading the skies. I had access to early internet. I figured out how to pick locks. I devoured books like the SAS manual. And that's what I was doing for the next, I don't know how long. But as I was doing all of this, there was one skill in particular that kind of stumped me. And that was the skill of lore. So I did what I usually did. In order to understand something, I went, with my obsession with dictionaries and encyclopedias, over to the dictionary trying to figure out what lore exactly was. And it turns out it's an archaic word that simply means the truth. And so as I was developing all of these other skills, I decided to develop my skill of lore as well, to study what the truth is. And since all of this was connected to this game, I thought to myself, well, how am I going to enter into this study of the truth? Well, it was through virtue. And so then and there, I decided to figure out what virtue actually was. Because again, you had these game virtues within the game, which I didn't totally agree with and went south pretty quickly when you got to about Ultima 9. And I had the tradition in my upbringing of understanding what the ancient virtues were, the religious idea of virtues were. And I wasn't exactly enthralled with those either. So I decided to do what Marcus Aurelius had said. He says, ask what is a thing? What is the thing within itself? And so I literally, and this is the way I thought about it at the time, I literally went on a quest for knowledge to understand what virtue was within itself. I had already looked at the dictionaries and the encyclopedias, and they were no help. So I decided to go into much heavier sources. So I went to the Bible, tried to figure out what virtue was there. And by the way, this would involve me traveling all the way to the local university to go to the giant encyclopedia room where they kept all the concordances, and using the concordances there to look up all of the passages for these things, try to figure out what the definition for virtue was. And while I was there, I learned that there were concordances for ancient books as well, not just the Bible. Concordances is references for all of these things within a literary tradition, like every word, basically. It was the index or Google search for words within ancient books before we had anything like Google. So again, went to the Bible, didn't find what I was looking for. So then I went to the great philosophers of the Western civilization tradition. I went to Augustine of Hippo, didn't find what I was looking for. I went to Plato, went to Aristotle, didn't find what I was looking for. I went to Thomas Aquinas, didn't find what I was looking for. And mind you, I was doing this as a part of all of the rest of my life. So as I was doing these things, years were passing. And it even influenced by the time I got to do the thesis for my master's. It influenced the entire thing that I did for my thesis. I was basically categorizing everything in ancient Greek prior to Plato and Aristotle to show the successive development of the idea of inspiration. That was part of it anyway. And the reason why I chose to do that was because I thought to myself, okay, there might be some things in Greek and Latin that I have not gotten a hold of yet in order to understand what virtue is. Therefore, I'm going to systematically go through everything written prior to Plato and Aristotle in order to see if I can find some last thread to tug on to figure out what the definition of virtue is within itself. And by this time, I was coming on close to 20 years of this quest for knowledge to understand what virtue was. And I could not find out what it was. Now, I was finding out other things along the way. I was finding out what the definition of honor was. Go back to the quote from Plato that I always pull out on this channel every once in a while. Honor, he says, consists in following the better and doing our utmost to effect the betterment of the worse when it admits of being bettered. And basically, I understood it like a tape measure, that you would use on a carpenter worksite. You take your tape measure, you hook it on the truth, you pull it down, and then you scale everything downwards, how close they are to the truth. And the things that are closer to the truth are the things that have more honor. And the people who participate in the things that are closer to the truth are the people that have more honor. I begin to understand these ideas around virtue. Ideas like honor, ideas like righteousness, as it is opposed to self-righteousness, which would be reflecting what the truth actually is, instead of trying to create something out of your own will that you think of as the truth. All of these things I was beginning to learn over the years as I sought out what virtue was. But again, was coming up to about the 20-year mark of this quest for knowledge, and I was getting very dismayed. And I thought to myself, well, what am I going to do? I've pretty much exhausted all of what I considered relevant sources on the matter. And no, I was not going to go to, let's say, Eastern religions or whatever else. They're not rational. I wouldn't waste my time on that. It's just like the fact that I went into other mythologies as well, Norse, Celtic, and I quite enjoyed reading the Celtic stuff. But again, they're not rational. So I'm not going to find the rational explanation for one of the most rational things in the world by going to non-rational sources. So anyways, coming up on this 20-year mark, I decided to myself, okay, if I've exhausted pretty much all the ancient sources that I can find, I'm just going to have to start again. I'm going to have to start from the first and work at it from the beginning. So quickly upon making that decision, I reached over to my complete works of Augustine of Hippo, and I looked through the index, and I found all the references to virtue, and I started to read. And guess what happened? Within about 10 minutes, I found the definition of virtue that I was looking for. And what did he do in his definition of virtue? Well, he was quoting the Bible. And I thought to myself, how in God's name did I not see this to begin with? How did it take me 25 years to realize this? And then, again, a few minutes of thinking gave me the key to understanding all of what I had gone through. You see, it wasn't the fact that I missed this when I first started looking for the definition of virtue. I saw it, I'm sure I did. I went exhaustively through the concordances. But the point was that what I was doing over that successive 20 years was reordering my mind. I was getting rid of all the junk that society had placed in my brain that it considered true, but wasn't actually true. Ideas like those science fiction and fantasy ideas, mostly from science fiction, things like Star Trek, Battlestar Galactica, Stargate, these ridiculous ideas that had no actual footing in the truth. And once I had done that, once I had cleared out the junk and reordered my mind according to what is true, according to reality, according to reason and logic, I was very easily able to see how Augustine was completely right. And what was that definition that Augustine gave? Well, he said, quite literally, and I'm going from memory, and so it seems to me that is a short definition of what virtue is. It is the order of love, the order amores. As the psalmist said, he quotes, "O God, order love within me," which itself, I think, is a quote from Solomon and the book of Proverbs, which is one of the books of wisdom. And what does this all mean? Well, it means that you take something like the definition of honor, which I just went over. You take those objective standards, those disimpassioned standards of ordering things, measuring them according to what is true, and then you internalize them according to the love you have within you, which is extremely important. You take that objective standard, determined by the truth, and you make it the standard for your subjective love. And in the process, what you will to do as well. Because again, going back to Augustine of Hippo, the love and the will are very intimately connected with each other. Love itself is a process of putting your love on something and then moving yourself, willing yourself to move towards that thing so you can embrace it. And when you embrace it, that's joy, that's happiness. So yeah, you take that objective standard of honor and you internalize it not only according to love, but you love the thing itself. And that's what virtue is. And that's how that leads into the ancient definitions of virtue. And he goes on to talk about those things and explain them and explore them. And so do so many others. And I got to see how Plato was right, how Aristotle was right, how Aquinas was right. Now, after all of that, I'm sure you're asking yourself, how does this lead into what I wanted to talk about? The revival of the idea of hero. Well, again, we go back to J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, schooling people on the order of mores, schooling people on the order of love. And why was he doing that? Well, he was doing it according to something which, quite honestly, I have done videos on, talking about the creation, the American creation in different decades of what an American hero actually is. I do believe this goes far back into the creation of comic books themselves. I could go into Jack Kirby and things like that, which I have in other videos, so I won't do it here. I'll just go back to the last time this thing actually happened, which again is connected to me very personally. If you look at those Marvel heroes, which began in the 1960s, late 1960s, and were really created in the 1970s, became fleshed out full heroes in that sense. Why were they created in such a way? Well, here is my thesis of why they were created in such a way. It was because America, within the 60s, had just undergone and was undergoing into the 70s, one of its regular patterns of immigration. Immigration from places wherein they would take in as many people as possible, and then they would close the borders because they had to assimilate these people. Because why? Because so many were coming in that they weren't assimilating correctly, and there was a mass spike in crime, in lawlessness. And again, this is personal experience. When I was young, from the time I was born, we lived at the outskirts, the very outskirts of one of the major American cities on the East Coast. And we had to leave. We had to leave in the 70s. Why? Because it became such a dangerous place. Why? Because these people were not conforming themselves to American standards of law and order. They simply weren't. We had to leave. This is why we moved to the country. And this is why the Marvel that you know and the Marvel heroes that you know were created and developed. It was because, and this is part of the reason why most Marvel heroes were based in New York, most people were looking around them at the time and saying, this lawlessness that is gripping our country, we have to get a hold of it. And so we were given inspirational heroes. At the same time, the government was, again, closing the doors and trying to assimilate these people. And so the stories went into what was basically the most wretched hive of scum and villainy, which was New York City. And you had these characters which were fighting for truth and justice, fighting for lawfulness, and fighting for the heroic idea of order amore. And it's funny, it took to about the mid-1980s for that to actually take place. And that's why most of the stories within the 1980s started to be generic hero adventures. I was just watching, Fright Night 2. There's a channel on YouTube. It's called Creature Features, which I think they license these old, usually B movies, and then play them. You can go and watch them. And I watched Fright Night 2, which actually, I don't know why people hate on this movie. I think it holds up really well. But there was a scene within the first of the movie. This is 1988, where the girl is walking out, one of the side characters, just a throwaway character. She's at a university in a American city. I'm not entirely sure what city it's set in, but it's dark. It's the nighttime. She walks out of her dorm and across the university. And then as she's doing this, she gets attacked by vampires. Now this scene works. Why? Because the default of why this is horrific is the fact that this girl is completely secure in doing so. In walking in the night, in the dark, across a deserted university, in a city, in America, the default of her thought was, I am safe. And I thought to myself, you couldn't do that today. I don't think you could. Your default, at the very least, in the back of your mind wouldn't be, I am safe. But that's why this scene works, because she's safe. Everyone in the audience thinks she's safe. That's why the horror element comes into it, because they learn she is not safe. And why? Well, because of supernatural elements, of course. Not because you have rampant lawlessness, not because you have people that were introduced to your society who don't understand or follow the rules of law and really just civilized behavior, but because of something fantastical. And that sense in the mid-1980s of security didn't come about just because. It came about because within the late 60s and throughout the 70s, people had to fight for it. And that's what our heroes were doing. They were fighting for it. That's why Spider-Man was patrolling New York, trying to ensure there was a lawless society about him. And not just ensure that, but assure it according to an order of mores. And like I said, I know this goes back further and has a complicated history and a developing one as well. But this is the same thing about Superman. This is why Superman has a tagline of truth, justice, and the American way. And this is why Superman is a citizen of Metropolis and an American. You have these ridiculous people that I used to argue with online saying, oh, that's not Superman anymore. He's now a citizen of the world. And you have people like Gene Yang at DC Comics trying to get rid of the American way. They had another attempt at this just less than a month ago, trying to eliminate that from the title of Superman. But no, that is Superman's title. Superman, as a boy, grew up in Kansas. He wants to take that small town, country wholesomeness and bring it into something like Metropolis. Metropolis, by the way, as I learned from creating maps for my own fantasy and superhero graphic novels, Metropolis and Gotham are both supposed to be New York City. Metropolis is simply uptown without any of the rest of New York City, and Gotham is the rest of New York City without uptown. But again, you have these left-wing people saying, well, Superman is a citizen of the world. Why doesn't he go and save people all over the world and save the world? Why? Because his city is Metropolis. He is one man, he has a limited amount of time, and so he follows the order of mores. He protects himself, he protects his family, he protects his friends around him. That's why he's always saving Jimmy and Lois. And then he protects his city. His city is his community. He can take those small town, country, wholesome American ideas that fit themselves onto a random spot in Kansas and apply them to a gigantic city like Metropolis because he's Superman. But he's doing it again according to the Order of Mores. That's why he concentrates on Metropolis. That's his city. That's his community. And the Order of Mores, after he saves himself and his family and his friends, is his city. And then his country. And then, if possibly needed, the world. And again, I would say the whole saving the world thing came about from the ultimate security that people felt within the 1980s, the mid-1980s. And that's where those world-saving stories came from. But that's not where his heroism lies. His heroism lies in the Order of Mores. Why? Because true heroism is following virtue. A true hero is a paragon of virtue. That's the traditional way of looking at it in the Western civilization canon for 3,000 years. And that virtue is according to the Order of Mores. And if he doesn't follow that virtue, then he's not a hero. He's a superpowered individual. That's it. The order of superhero is that hero controls the super. If you take away that hero part by taking away the virtue part, no, he's just an individual with a lot of power. That's it. And the same thing is playing out within real life as well. A lot of people always talk about the, 5 or 7 personality traits that distinguish a conservative person from a liberal person. I don't pay too much attention to it because really they're just talking about the virtues in a way they don't want to talk about the virtues. But they say that people on the left typically value compassion above everything else, and they only really focus on 3 of the 5 personality traits, whereas a conservative focuses on all 5 of them at once, and therefore, as compared with the liberal, is more diluted in the way that he does things. So, for example, a conservative would have a high regard for something like loyalty, whereas a liberal would say, no, I don't care about loyalty. I care about compassion above all else. That might even exclude any loyalty whatsoever. And people are going over this, not connecting it once again to virtue, but going over it and saying, well, this liberal way of thinking is just a different way of thinking than the conservative way of thinking. But it's not just a different way of thinking. It's a disordered way of thinking. Why? Because it's just like the virtues, because really what they're talking about is virtue, just in another form, because they don't want to admit that it's virtue. The idea of the virtues is that you must pursue them all. That's part of what I'm always talking about. First, you must have right reason, which again goes back to your Order of Mores, and then you actually get to pursue the virtues themselves. They are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And the thing about temperance is, what does temperance do? It reorders all of the rest of the virtues so that they work in concert with each other, one not trampling on the other. But that's the way the Order of Mores works. It needs to have them in order. You can't ignore one to the supposed aggrandizement of the other. If you do that, you become a villain. And that's what these people are doing. They're saying compassion above all else. And yes, compassion is laudable. Love for others is laudable. But when you take it to its extreme like that, with ignoring all of the rest of the virtues and all of the rest of the things that are necessary for the order of love, when they take the order out of love, it becomes disordered and it becomes villainous. And I just ran across over the last couple of weeks these people and their insane ideas with compassion above all else. One of them was a guy arguing for the fact that we can't gatekeep. It doesn't matter. He was slightly, supposedly, on the conservative way of thinking and seeing that the destruction of video games and things like that because of this quote-unquote progressive nonsense that has been injected into them. But he couldn't get to the level of saying, I want to gatekeep video games in order to keep this out. Why? Because, he said, it might exclude some people. And I'm sitting there going, who cares? His entire argument was based upon the fallacy of perfectionism. He's saying, unless we have a perfect idea, we can't do anything at all. And his idea of perfectionism comes, just like the rest of your quote-unquote progressive people, on the utopian ideal that we must have compassion above everything else. So much so that it excludes having to be just. That's why he thinks to himself, I'm sure, well, I'm being compassionate in that we can't do anything if it excludes one person. No, I'm sorry. You need to move forward. Yes, I'm sure 1 or 2 people or a dozen people or 100 people might be excluded. So what? You got to move forward and do something because the rest is ordered according to the Order of Mores. And it leads to the extreme in the other direction. Again, just ran across this in the last week. Some guy posting on social media saying he would rather see 100 people unjustly condemned for, well, let's just say, assaulting a woman, than to see one person who actually did such a deed go free. And I'm thinking to myself, you actually believe that your the compassionate person here, the just person here, when you're literally promoting injustice on a massive scale because you think that that compassion trumps everything else, that there is no order to your compassion, it must obliterate everything else. But no, I'm sorry, no. If you even go back to, I'm sure somebody is thinking to themselves, the Christian idea of the definition of love, as it starts to list what love is, and you get near the bottom, it says, it rejoices not in wickedness, but in the truth. And that statement points you right directly to the order of mores. It says, yeah, you have love, but it needs to be ordered. And again, the order of love, according to what we're talking about, according to what the vice president was saying, according to what and how these heroes, especially in Marvel Comics, developed in the 1970s, is the idea that you have love for yourself, you have love for your family next, and then next for your friends, and then next for your community, and then next for your country. And it goes like concentric circles, rippling outwards from there. But these people, these far leftists, these quote unquote progressive people, they think to themselves, no, we're going to jump to, I have compassion on the most supposedly wretched people imaginable. Those people who are heinous criminals who entered illegally into this country. Because quite honestly, that's what the protests you see around you today are protesting. They're protesting the ejection from the country of people who are the worst of the worst criminals. But no, they're saying, and they think to themselves, they're the most compassionate and just people because they're skipping out on giving love to the people around them, their family, their friends, their community, their country. They're going to, I'm the best person ever because I give it to this most wretched person, which is way out there. I'm sorry, no. You're the most disordered person there is, and you're a villain. You're trying to support these people above your family, your friends, your community, your city, your country. Your so-called love, your so-called justice is so disordered that you cannot even see the fact that you, in this situation, are the villain. But again, the answer to this entire question that I posed at the beginning is, when are we going to get back to a time where we can have true heroes? A time where we can feel safe like they did in the mid-1980s? Well, again, I didn't think it was possible that we could move this fast. But we now have, once again, the vice president literally talking about the order of mores, literally schooling people who are supposed to be religious and moral leaders over the country about the order of love, about how things are supposed to work, which, again, is something that has happened in a secular manner within American history over and over again when we got too many immigrants coming in at once who don't assimilate, let alone throwing open the border for everyone, which allows the worst of the worst to come flooding across into the country. But no, we now have leadership. And again, there was just, I think it was yesterday, 3 days ago, the president gave a press conference and he was asked, the vice president has said X, Y, and Z about this thing. What do you think? And he said, well, I don't know the exact circumstance that you're talking about, but if the vice president said it, I back the vice president 100%. And so we have a leadership, a vice president who is literally, as I said, speaking about the order of mores. The key to understanding true heroism, the key to living out true heroism. Because not only does it answer the question of how do we order our charity towards others, but it answers the question of how do we order ourselves and our actions in accord with what is real, in accord with what is right, which is to say, how can we, as everyday citizens, be virtuous people? And in the end, like it occurred in the 70s and the 80s, bring about a secure society where heroes can go from fighting for order to relaxing in the safety of what we have built. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, there are 2 links in the description for my 3 graphic novels that center around the traditional idea of a hero, and you're looking at some of the art for those in the background. So if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novels are for you. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later.